Welcome to Janome Club, brought to you by Janome Australia. We will be showcasing different Janome machines and accessories to enhance your sewing experience, covering a variety of topics, including quilting, dressmaking, and embroidery, with handy tips and tricks along the way so that you can get the most out of your Janome machine. For more inspiration, please like and subscribe, or you can check out our website at janome.com.au. Now let's get creating. This month, we're going to be talking about the sewing guides. These are some of the sewing guides that we can get on our Janome machines. Most machines do come with this standard sewing guide, from I think about our mid-range up to our top of the lines, all come with this sewing guide, which is a left-hand sewing guide. And we also have our extra long sewing guides, which are these two at the front. They come as a 2-pack. And you do get a left and a right. And I'll be showing you how you set them on the feet and then use them on your machine. If you don't have, so these guides here all work with either your standard shank or your AccuFeed, your dual feed feet. So these are the guides that are used for those two shanks and feet. And then if you do have our standard walking foot, which you can get for pretty much every machine, low shank and high shank, the normal just sort of walking foot, these have different guides. You can either buy them as a set as themselves, or you can buy this as one whole unit with the convertible convertible walking foot and guides. So with these particular guides here, they just clip into the back and then you just press them down and they are in place. If you want to adjust this, it's a matter of loosening off the screw and then you can slide it left and right and we can press the bar over as well. And then you would just set whatever measurement you wanted from your needle position here to the edge of the guide, you would set that needle position. So what the guides are useful for is when you want to sew parallel lines, either over a quilt or down a skirt or anything like that, or even like decorative rows of stitches around the edge of a skirt down the hem, looks lovely. I also use these guides when I am sewing hems or top stitching, like a wider, I often use them, say, like on my jeans or when I've made a full skirt and then I'm stitching around the hem. That's when I use them the most for my seam allowances and things. With the standard guide and the long guide, these just slide into your the hole that's on your shank. So these ones, they literally just slide in sideways. It's quite a firm push. There is a little rubber sort of gasket that sits in the little hole at the back. So it is quite a firm push to push that in, and then you have your guide. And to adjust this one, you literally would pull it out or push it into, again, the measurement that you require. The AccuFeed feet work exactly the same. There is a little hole here, and it's just a matter then of taking the guide, and it again is just a firm push in there, and you would then set your width that you want to sew. So what I'll do is I'll show you the difference with the guides here. Pull them all out again. Oops. So that's to show you the difference in the length that you can get. So this one here, once it's in your shank, I think you get maybe about 2 inches would be the most that you would get, whereas you can get twice that, so 4 inches with the long quilting guide bars. And remember, it does come in a left and a right. So especially if you've got a smaller machine where you do have to roll up your quilt and you're working from the center of your quilt out, then I do find the left-hand guide works well. Whereas when I'm doing hems and if I'm working on a larger machine, I tend to just use my right-hand guides all the time. So let's grab this one and we're going to put it on our machine. So I've already got my foot on. I'm just locating the hole at the back of the foot, and then I am just sliding the guide into position. You've got a couple of options for setting the distance. If it's on the right-hand side, you do have your needle plate markings. So if I wanted to do it at, say, like a 2-inch gap, I would just find the 2-inch mark on my needle plate, and then I would set my right-hand guide up in line with that 2-inch line that's marked on my needle plate. With going off onto the left, it'd just be a matter of grabbing a ruler or a tape measure, putting that at your needle position, and then working out how wide you want your line. So say if I wanted this one to be 3 inches, I would then just set that at my 3-inch line. And I know then from my center needle position to that guide, it's exactly 3 inches. So when I'm going to do my sewing, I would have my beautiful parallel lines there. So here we have our project of the month. This is for December, and it is a bed runner. So it is made up of these sections of strips that you make up, and then you alternate them sort of left and right. It's quite an easy project if you follow the instructions to tell you how many sections to join up of your little squares and then join them together with your strips. And then once that's all sewn together, you get this beautiful bed runner that we've put a feature embroidery on it. You could again just put a feature fabric there, and it just goes and goes and goes, because this is made to go across the end of a full queen size bed. You could also use this same design if you wanted to make a table runner or placemats or anything like that. You could chop this up then into placemats and you would have them all made. Now, as a little bonus for this month as well, we will also be showing you how to do this flange binding. So it is a bind, which then has this extra little peeper part, and it is fully sewn by machine. So we'll be showing you that as well today. So we're going to go over to our machine, and we've put in our guide. I'm then going to grab my little quilt here that I'm going to be sewing on. Find the section that I'm going to work on. Oh, thank you. I'll put it underneath. Oh, yes. So what I would like to do is I want to sew. Is that going to sit up there? No. I want to sew in the middle of this square here. I've got like this, this is quite a plain quilt that I found, and I decided it needs a little bit of jazzing up. And I've got, it's sort of made of these black and white squares in like a cross pattern. So I want to stitch down the center of this square. It already had some quilting on it, but I decided it needs a bit of color. So I'm going to measure. I've got 4.5 inches here. So I need to go 2.25 inches to get in the middle of this. So I've set from my needle position to the guide, 2.25 inches. I then know that I can line the guide up with my seam line that's here, and I know I will be perfectly placed for it to be stitching right in the center. So I can then have that guide. Now what I'm doing is, as I'm sewing, I'm not looking at where my needle is stitching. I'm always looking at this guide here and making sure that it stays where I am on this seam line. So that as I'm sewing along, it is where my eye is looking, is over here at the guide, making sure that it stays on that seam line. And then I know that where I'm stitching will be perfectly parallel to this line in my quilt. So this could be a seam line that you're using. It could be a previous stitch line. In the project for the table runner, we do get you to draw your first line down the center of the quilt, and then you work out either way with that. And you'll be adjusting your guide to a couple of different measurements, and you stitch in various different colors of thread to get a beautiful design over the quilt. So where I would then stitch this all the way along, we're just going to stop there and show you. And then you can see here, and I had done a previous row as well. Just put that there. You'll see I've now got a beautiful parallel line there. If I then wanted to do a different line, I could move my guide. Obviously, I could line that up with there, and I could stitch again. Another option I do like to use this is when I do a wavy line that I still want to be reasonably parallel down my quilt. So I've got my reference line here, which is my previous stitching line. And I would start sewing. So with doing a wavy line with my walking foot, I'm going to actually be swinging my quilt as it is stitching. So I'm still going to keep my eye on this guide and my previous row of stitching, but I'm going to let it swing maybe 1.5 centimeters either side as I go along. And that way I know I'm still going to end up reasonably parallel with my quilt, but I'm going to have a different variation of my line. So I'll show you that there. So there you can see that I can end up with a beautiful curved line, but it's still going to be reasonably parallel. I'm not going to go off completely off skew of my actual quilting, and that is another beautiful feature that I like to use with these guides. Okay, I'll show you another example where we've used the guides. This is a quilt from the CM7. I had to think there for a minute. The CM7 workbook. So the Continental M7 workbook has got this as one of the projects in it, and it is to make a queen size quilt that utilizes the quilt block advisor, which has got different what has it got now, 10 quilt blocks in it, and I've used the same quilt block, but we've made it up in 2 different sizes. So one has just got a 9 patch of the larger triangles, and then another one which has got, what's that, 2, 4, 6, that's a 36 patch then, is that right? Of half square triangles, and then you swap them around to make 2 different blocks of each color. So there is a second block there as well. And then we're putting just grey squares on either side of these center blocks, and we've done some beautiful decorative hand look stitching, which is it's a stitch that's part of the Continental range. So the CM7 and CM17 both have the hand look quilt stitch, and what it does is it takes your beautiful perfect machine stitches and you can then make them slightly wonky. And that allows you then to do a stitch that looks like you may have sat there for hours and hand stitched it, but really you did it on your machine. So we have used the guides here to stitch these lines running through the blocks. And we've obviously then just set it to the width that we wanted, and we've stitched down. And I often find when I'm doing wider, larger pieces like this, is I'll often do like every, say, like 4 rows, and then I'll come back into the centers and things like that. It just depends on the design of the quilt to what you end up using, but we've used the guide and just followed along the stitch line as we've sewn and made sure that you then end up with these beautiful parallel lines. Okay, so we're going to get on and show you this flange binding. So here's the first example, which is this one. So with this particular one, the flange, so the binding part is in green, and then our flange is this little stripy blue fabric, and they're about the same width to each other. But I'm going to show you how you work out the sizes of the flange and the bind so that you could make this any size you want for your quilt. Let's place this off to the side. We'll place that there. And I'm going to get my little example, and I'm going to show you another. So I'll just quickly put this on top to show you another little example. So this is the same style of flange binding, but you can see here my pink is like quite a large size, and my green little peeper, the little flange, is quite tiny. So you can alter the width of the bind, and you can also alter the width of the little flange. So if I bring this one in, you'll be able to see both of them there together, that they look quite different, but they're both done in exactly the same way. So when we go down to our little guide here to show you, so our outer bind fabric is the bind that you will see on the outside. So on our example here, that is the green. Actually, I won't use that one because that one's got, everyone will get confused with their colors. Let's go for this one. So our pink, which is our bind, is our outer bind fabric, whereas our green here is the flange. So that's this one here. So you'll see here on my measurements, what I've done is to work out how to do it, I've got 2 seam allowances because it's stitched on, like you join it on both sides. Then the center part that you need to work out how much is basically 2 times your required width, plus I always allow a little bit for the actual turn over the edge of your wadding. So I've said about 1/8 to 1/4. It does depend. If you use a thin wadding, you'll obviously need a bit less. If you use a nice big fat, say wool puffy wadding or a polyester wadding or something like that, you may need to add the full 1/4. So that is to work out for the outer bind. For the flange, basically it is cut exactly the same size, but you just have to add on 2 times however much you want your flange to be. So with this example here, I've got my flange will finish about 1/4 inch, which is about what we've got here on the bed runner sample, where I've got 2, like I've added on about an extra 1/2 inch, so that'll give me my wider bind. If I only wanted to do a really skinny flange here, then I would just add on, this is I think probably like 1/8 of an inch, so I might only add on 1 extra 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. It's basically twice whatever you want, because this flange has to go out and then back in. So that's my sort of easy way to find out. If you've Googled flange bindings, you will find all different measurements, because it really depends on how big you want the binding compared to how big you want the flange. So once you have cut your 2 pieces, you would join them into 2 big strips, and then you would sew those 2 strips together. Find my other little sample. So let's move that out of the way. So there's my 2 strips that I have joined together all the way down to make enough binding that I need for my flange. You would then press this in half. Oh, sorry. First thing you would do is you always press the seam allowance of these 2 joins to the skinny strip, which is the outside bind. And what that does, because my seam allowance is here over on my purple, that gives me a beautiful ditch here to be able to stitch in later, and we'll show you that in a minute. We then press this in half, and you can see there, so this is my binding fabric, and there's my little flange there. Because it's that little bit bigger, that's what becomes my flange. So once you've got that stitched all together, you would then add it to your quilt. Now, because this is a binding technique that goes onto by machine, we are going to stitch it on the back of our quilt first, then we're going to fold it over to the front and then finish stitching it down. So you do have to place it onto your quilt so you can only see the flange. The binding fabric will be underneath, and we're only seeing the flange here. We would then start stitching at a corner and stitch all the way around our quilt, and I will show you how I would stitch a corner. So we're going to come down here. Now I am using the HP2, which is a scant 1/4 inch foot. You could use your standard 0.25 inch foot as well, because we're stitching just our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch down, and I need to stop sewing exactly a 1/4 inch away from this edge of my quilt. So I've got 2 things that I can use as guides. I do have a little bar sort of guideline that is at the front of my foot, which is exactly a 1/4 inch out. And you do have those same guides. If I grab, where is my foot? I had it just before and now I can't find it. You would think that I would have. Aha, here we go. So also on the O foot, you do have the guides. So you'll see here on the front of the foot, we have 3 little check marks on the foot. And this one here denotes your needle position. So you then have a little mark here at the front, which is exactly a 1/4 inch in front of your needle, because that's where we need to stop. There is also markings actually on my needle plate where it is exactly a 1/4 inch in front of my needle. So I can utilize all of those little guides together, and I know then exactly where to stop. So I can take one more stitch, and I have stopped with my quilt lined up exactly with that 1/4 inch line. I've got my guide on my needle plate over here to check, plus I've got the little guide on my foot. Once I'm at my 1/4 inch point that I'm stopping, I then want to raise up my foot. I'm then going to rotate my work 45 degrees, and I'm going to stitch out to the corner of my quilt. So I've stitched now just off the corner of my quilt. I'm then going to raise my foot up again. If you do have a machine with auto foot lift and pivot, you can turn that on and it will then automatically raise your foot up. Let's do that now for our next section. So I've now got this little stitch line that comes down here from my seam and then up at 45 degrees out to my corner. That is now going to be my little fold line. So I'm going to fold my bind up against that little 45-degree stitch line. And you know it's right because this then is in line with the next side of my quilt. I then take this and fold it down towards me. I've lined up my folded edge with the top edge of my quilt, the raw edges with this side of my quilt, and then I just place it back under my foot and I start stitching right from the edge. And I would keep stitching that all the way around. Once you have gotten around the extra corner, I'm going to trim off my threads. And I have stitched, so I started at this corner here, I worked all the way around and I'm stopping here. So now I've got this section here which hasn't been done, and it is good to leave, you know, I've probably got about 10 or 12 inches here, a nice gap, because that allows me enough room to be able to work out how to join this. So this is a little technique that I find very useful, is that I lay my bindings down here and I'm going to cut them off at a nice 90 degrees. Okay, so it's nice and perpendicular to the edge of my quilt. And then I unpick these 2 layers so that they're both separate. And we're going to work just with the green one to start with. So I lay my piece of, so this is the start where I started. I then grab that little piece that I've cut off and I lay it down here. And that gives me my exact measurement to put a pin there. So this is the cut edge that I made, and that is the width of the bind. So this is the little piece that I've cut off, and I flip it round to the front, and that gives me my measurement here. This is my overlap. So now I'm going to grab my other piece of green. I just need to unpick this a little bit more. So now I take my other piece of green, I lay it down. So this is where my end that I've come to, so that it overlaps there. I then know exactly where to cut, where my pin is placed. I just want to cut this top piece of binding. And then that is the perfect overlap that I need. So we're then going to slide our quilt next to our foot, and this is where we would imagine stitching our binding on. So we're going to join it. First thing I do is I like to take a little bit of a pleat here so that we reduce some of our slack. And I just put a pin or a clip in there. So we just need that little bit of extra slack in there so that we can join these two pieces together. So the first thing I do is I take my top piece and I slide it out. I then take my second piece here, the one closest to me, and I'm going to flip it over. I'm then going to be stitching from this little corner here down to the bottom point. Cut off my stitches. And then we can release that little pin there. And we have joined our binding there. You would do exactly the same for the purple section and join that together. So you'd need to lay one down, cut off the length required, and then join them together. Once you've done that, you would then stitch the rest of this binding on. So here we have one that we've stitched our binding all the way around. Then what you do is that you would then press it. I like to take it to the iron, give it a nice press out, and we fold it over to the front of our quilt. To do the corners, it's just a matter of pressing one side over, and let's put a pin in there to hold it. And you can see there that I've pressed that over so that it's got this nice little sort of 45-degree angle there. And then I just fold that down then towards me. And you end up with that beautiful mitered corner there. I would then come in and top stitch this in the ditch. So I quite like using my stitch in the ditch foot, and I just run that little guide down that ditch that we created between the two rows, and you get a nice little bit of stitching there. So I'll show you some examples, and they will show you how you can finish it. So on this particular, the bed runner, we have got just one little tiny stitch of row of stitches in here. You would choose a colour. If you don't want to see it and you want it to sort of disappear, choose a colour that matches your flange. And then when you stitch in that little ditch there, it just disappears into the flange. If you do want to make it a little bit more of a feature, I like using a triple stitch. So here is one that's done with a triple stitch, and I've done it in a contrasting colour. So I've used a dark purple on this one, and I've done my triple stitch down there, and because it's a triple stitch, it'll go forward, back, forwards, forward, back, forwards, so it makes it a thicker again. You could use a thicker thread. You could even do actually a little decorative stitch here, like a little stitch that loops out, would look really pretty along the flange as well. I do believe I've got one more sample. This one here has got a stripe that we've done. So you can see that you can use different fabrics. The one here that we just sewed, it's got that beautiful lime green. So that makes a nice little pop of colour. So it's really good, these flange bindings, because you then do get the two pops of colour that you can do a nice frame. And I'll just show you the back as well. Because it is done by machine, you do end up with a row of stitching just here, but it's very neat and just sits nicely in just inside the bind, and you just get that beautiful little row of stitches there. So, and again, if you put the same sort of colour, I think if I look at the back of the green one, we've used a similar colour that it's very hard to see. The stitch line just runs just in here. You probably can hardly see it. I can hardly see it. There's a little stitch line that just runs just on the inside of my bind, and we've matched the same colour to our backing, so it completely disappears on your quilt. So as always, if there's anything here that you want some more information, you want to know which feet and accessories you can get for your machine, you can visit your local Janome stockist, and the details there are available on our website, janome.com.au, and you can also go to our inspirations tab and get the beautiful project, which is this bed runner that you really could use for anything if you made the strips longer. And thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us at Janome Club. We hope we have inspired you to keep on stitching. For more information on any of the machines, accessories, or projects that you've seen in today's video, please see the links in the description below, or visit the Janome Australia website at janome.com.au.